All right. All right. So welcome everybody. This is our chance to welcome Michelle Galen here to talk about broadcasting happiness. Thanks for joining us, Michelle.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
We've had some really great feedback from the podcast. People have loved it, and they have talked about how they've started to implement some of the stuff that we talked about, and they've gone out and gotten your book. And I had a bunch of people actually send me questions. They said they couldn't attend tonight, and they said, ask these questions for me. I said,
Okay,
well,
great.
we'll throw them out there. And for the people tuning in here, if you have a question that you would like to ask Michelle, just put it up in the chat, and we will do our best to answer as many of the questions as we can. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay. Well, let's get right to it. And a question that came in was, and this, we may have to explain this a little bit, but the question was, what are your thoughts about matrix reprogramming for people who have past traumas and they keep reliving these traumas in their emotional states is I think what they were getting at here. But in reprogramming those memories to something that it kind of changes the emotional content of that memory to help with the.
And so what to do in relation to that? Yeah, I mean, that's a very common struggle that I think people, we all have, right? I mean, whether it be on the more traumatic end of the spectrum or just normal sort of stresses that keep reoccurring. We're very habitual. We think about the same things kind of over and over and over. But there is a way to change the way we see those situations and the memories that have resulted from them. So in my book, I focus an entire chapter on this exact thing. And it's this idea of introducing new information. There is a relatively new field of study in positive psychology that looks at how our brain processes trauma and how our brain looks then at the traumatic situation weeks, months, and then years down the road. And, for a long time, what we've been told, whether it be officially or sort of this unofficial belief, is that if you suffer some traumatic experience, let's take if you were to go to war and something there were to happen, you have two options. You can either come back completely normal, or you can come back suffering from it. So we would talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. What we're seeing now in the research, though, is that there's this third path that we don't often focus on, but it is so powerful even to just know that it's a possibility. So researchers now are looking at post-traumatic growth. And post-traumatic growth is this ability that we all possess. For some of us, it's easier than others. It comes more naturally. But it's this ability to look at a traumatic situation and be able to take the valuable parts of it, or the pieces of, that have informed who we are today, have allowed us to grow through that struggle. So it's not saying, well, I wish more of this on myself, or if I could go back, I wouldn't have, didn't want to experience this, or I want to experience it again. It's just about accepting what happened, but also then taking the pieces from it that help us learn and grow. And we see that sometimes, soldiers in the same rehab room, maybe 2 or 3 of them will have each lost a leg, but there's 3 different ways to process that experience. One of them is, gets depressed. The other might be sort of his normal baseline self. And then the third one is the person who's going around cheering everyone else on as they go through the rehab process.
Right.
So I think that the best way to encourage post-traumatic growth is to actively search for facts and information that can help transform that memory that we have. Memory is very much like thinking through a process. I mean, I think people think, oh, this memory is lodged in my brain and that's it. It's written and it's done. But by introducing new information, like how we've grown, the relationships we've had, the changes in our life that resulted from that experience that were actually positive. By introducing that new information, we can look upon the situation completely differently, and it'll help us process the challenge in a new and different way. And I, as always with a lot of these strategies, I encourage writing those things down, finding the facts and writing them down, because when our brain goes back to stressing about that situation later on, we already have the list of advantages to having experienced it.
Now, along those same lines with the PTSD, I know there's been some research done on assessing before the event even occurs certain aspects of people that will predict whether they're the ones that can experience that or not. I mean, is that a baseline state that can be trained, or is that something innate, kind of like that set point type of a theory?
Yeah, I mean, I think some things that feed into how people process challenges, it's natural levels of resiliency, it's your grit, it's optimism. I mean, in our work, and our work focuses mostly on the, how we operate in the corporate world, we look at the three greatest predictors of long-term levels of success. And a lot of it has to do with how we process challenges, right? Do we look at it as a challenge or a threat? Are we optimistic about the outcome of that challenge? Do we believe our behavior matters? And do we feel connected to our social support network, to the people around us? So we feel like we're part of something greater than ourselves. When people score higher on those metrics, we see that not only does that also correlate with being higher, having higher levels of resilience and grit, but it also oftentimes connects with higher levels of long-term success, both at work and outside of work as well.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot in the book about mindset, and I'm a big fan of Carol Dweck's, and I think she's written the greatest work on mindset that I've ever read, and a lot of people are using it now. But when you talk about it in the book, I mean, are there ways that we can accelerate that process of getting into that mindset, or are we? I mean, is it something we really have to work hard at? I mean, is it something easily changed or not easily changed?
I mean, I think it can be easily changed if we're diligent about it. It oftentimes depends on how traumatic the experience was and how where we're at with it right now. But by actively mining the environment for a new set of facts, and then every time we are feeling negative about the situation, going back to them and reminding ourselves, at some point what happens is the brain moves from that negative or stressed position, the traumatized position, into a place of balance, and then ultimately, hopefully, flourishing as well. And that's how we create the growth.
Yeah. I had a client that actually was in today and was talking about, I had referred them to your book because they were talking about this negative person in their office and how it affected their lives so dramatically. And she's basically saying that she has this one colleague that's always complaining about absolutely everything. I mean, it's not anything specific. So it's absolutely everything. And she'll come in and she'll plop down at her desk and start talking. And she started trying your approach of starting off with a positive comment. And she's found that number one, she can't get it off quick enough because she gets snuck up on. And two, whenever she says something positive, it's either ignored or dismissed, and they go on with their negative. Yeah. What can she do in that situation?
That's exceptionally challenging. I think we've all had those people at some point in our lives. Not so easy when they're in the cubicle next to us. I did some work with some high-level directors at Google, all women, and there was this retreat and we looked at some of these challenges with them. And one of them said to me, and she's like literally the most positive person you'll ever meet. She said to me, I swear that the most negative person that works at my company sits right next to me. And then we restructured and he got closer, and then he got closer, and then he got, she said, if we restructure one more time, the guy's going to be sitting in my lap. But within that joke though, joking about that situation, I could see from her a really, she was pained about it because she's sitting there, not only for herself, but obviously also for this guy that he saw the world in this negative way. But she had to sit there and listen to him on phone calls complaining to people, or popping his head up over his cubicle wall and complaining to her. What oftentimes happens is because we might have at some point in our lives encountered a person like this and tried our best to help them see the light, see a new reality, it didn't feel like it worked. I think what happens is people globalize it to say, well, then you can't change anybody. What I'm seeing now in the research is that you absolutely can change other people. It might not be on our timeline. That's the only unfortunate thing. But by being positive ourselves and using the power lead, which is starting conversations off with that positive, meaningful, optimistic comment, slowly we're changing the way those people see the world. But sometimes, like your clients encountering, we can't get it in there fast enough, or they just seem to continue on with their negative streak. So when that happens, I encourage people to use something I call a strategic retreat. It is okay to set boundaries and retreat from those negative people. Retreats normally are cowardly in war situations, but strategic retreats are exceptionally brilliant because what they do is they allow us to bolster our resources. So in this case, bolster our own positive resources against that negative person, and then re-enter the situation with a new positive, more positive and more reinforced mindset. So for this client of yours and for anyone else dealing with a negative person consistently, what I would say is take that strategic retreat. So if it's in your cubicle, how about popping in noise canceling headphones, angling your computer so they're out of line of sight and you don't have to listen to them complaining. If it's someone that you run into in the hallway, how can you shorten the experience with them? So, or maybe you need to get some information from them, get to their office, don't go in, don't close the door, just stand in the doorway, get the information you need, say something nice, and leave. So that you're lessening the power that they have to influence your mindset in that moment. And then also just keep at it with the positive comments, and sending positive vibes their way, because ultimately it does make a difference. It might take some time, but it will be fruitful. What we see in the research, and this is something I find so fascinating and hopeful and encouraging, is that, oftentimes I'm asked, who's the most powerful person, the positive person or the negative person in setting corporate culture or, at home? And they're thinking of that one negative person that seems to bring the entire room down. And what we find, it's not the most positive or negative person that wins the battle for culture. It's the most expressive person. So the more she can be expressive of that positive mindset over that negative person and get others to be positively expressive as well, the more they all have a chance to sort of mute that negative person and lessen his power.
Yeah, she was saying that it's tough because it's in her office and that she gets kind of trapped in there. So the strategic retreat has been a little difficult. So what I suggested was to get another colleague and just go into this gal's office and sit down and start talking about nothing but positive and just stay there all day talking about positive things.
I think she can have a good impact. The other thing is I worked with this high-level manager at a company, and he had grown the company from 5 employees to 200, but was very dedicated to keeping the culture the way it had originally started. So it was very involved in hiring as many people as possible, but with 200 people, you can't be there for everything and run the show. So he ended up with this one woman who was chronically negative. They ended up working together for about 5 or 6 years, and he said, at first I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should even approach her about her negativity and the impact it's having, because it was having a negative impact on productivity, on people's feelings that they can speak up and say, present an idea in a meeting. And she was raining on everybody's parade. But then he said at some point, I decided that we had enough social capital that I could sit her down and I could have a discussion about it and what it's doing. And, and he did it in a very nice way. The guy was a gentle soul, but it ended up being really fruitful. They had a really honest discussion. It went well. And I warn people, this can go one of 2 ways. So you have to use your own personal judgment on which way it can go. But it actually was good. And she changed her disposition. She was more mindful because she said she didn't even realize the influence she was having on other people by bringing all that negativity with her to work.
Yeah. This next question came to me on Facebook, and I don't know the person who asked it, but it's an interesting question. My husband lives in a world of fear of societal collapse. he won't travel and constantly listens to shows that promote his agenda. How can I shift this?
Yeah, that's challenging. So in fear of the world because of what he's watching on TV.
Yeah, and then apparently he keeps watching that same stuff.
Yeah. So this is a problem. We are being fed very negative news, very unbalanced news on TV. And the biggest problem is not so much that it's negative. The bigger problem is that it feeds us with fear and tells our brain that our behavior doesn't matter. The reality is that there's millions of things outside of our control in this world, right? You get into a car, you don't know who else is going to be driving down the road. You don't know if they've had stuff to drink. You don't know if people are wearing seatbelts in other cars. Things happen, right? But the problem becomes when our brain starts to believe that all things are beyond our control, and that's when the fear can really escalate. I would say the first step, if at all possible, is get your loved one off of those programs, because we're just feeding the beast, right? And then recognize that, we just did some research with Ariana Huffington and researcher Sean Achor, who's my research colleague. And what we found is that just 3 minutes of negative news in the morning can lead to a 27% higher likelihood of reporting your day as unhappy 6 to 8 hours later. And why that becomes so significant is that shows us that it's not just, oh, I watch negative news for a few minutes and I don't feel good, I feel depressed or down or whatever. No, it's not just an immediate mood shift. It actually stays with you in your time at work and your time with your family. And I think it transforms how we view our role in this world, how we show up. So the more that we can show our brain that our behavior matters, give ourselves a more optimistic picture of this world, the less fear can encroach upon our thinking. So I'd say first, get off those programs, and then second, start to build a more hopeful picture of this world by feeding our brain with other information, inspiring stories of people who've overcome challenges, the ways in which the world is amazing, our gratitude list. Those things will just absolutely transform our thinking, and there's hope, because even people who have been chronically pessimistic all their lives, by even doing something as little as listing their gratitudes for a period of 6 months, they were able to test as low to moderate level optimists in just that period of time. So it's possible to make changes at any point.
Now, why do you think it is that, our bodies have to sense the fact that they go into this kind of negative feeling, this negative energy when we view news in the morning that's giving us this bad news or this negative news. Why is it that we seem to be addicted to doing it?
Well, there's a physical response. We get the brain chemicals change. We get cortisol and adrenaline, and while those might not feel good, if we are exposed to it, feel it, at some point, our body sort of gets used to that state, and then we don't feel ourselves if we're not feeding that. Also, I think, some people so it becomes a habit, but I think also some people, they want to be in the know. They want to know what's going on in the world, and they think that reading or watching the news as it is today, right, it's highly skewed negative, is the way that you stay informed. But that skewed picture isn't good for us. What I find really interesting, I wrote at the end of the book, I included something called the Journalist Manifesto, which is, it's a document largely for news media and news executives, but it's really, I think, ultimately beneficial for everyone to read, all of us as news consumers, because what it does is it informs us on what the research is saying about the influence of news on the brain, and then how to source out more positive news. And so what I found really ultimately interesting is that while it might seem that everyone wants to consume negative news and the most eyeballs are on the negative stories, when it comes to the longevity of a story and the likelihood for people to share those stories with their networks, so on social media or when they're talking to people around the water cooler, people are significantly more likely to share positive, practical, useful, or inspiring stories than they are of the negative stories. And I think ultimately what that tells me is that gives me hope that that's really ultimately the content that people truly desire.
Now, is there a positive news radio station that people can listen to in the mornings?
Yeah, well, there's, luckily just about all news organizations, not all of them, are offering positive, inspiring stories, solutions-focused stories. But what's really encouraging is now with the internet and with just such a low barrier to entry to creating positive content, what I'm seeing more and more of are, websites that are dedicated to featuring businesses that are doing good for the world, or there's a hyper local website focused on positive stories coming out of Northwest Indiana. And NPR does this series, and CBS, 60 Minutes can be really positive content. So it's just about being your own personal filter. Having the TV on cable news shows that repeat the same 5 negative, stress-inducing stories, that's not good for us.
Now, what kind of practical things can people, you talk about ways that we can relate bad news in productive, supportive ways, but you also talk about spinning the positive so that it's most likely to propagate and take hold. What kind of steps can we take? What boots on the ground things can we do to really help kind of promote that positive news and spreading of that?
Think of yourself as a broadcaster. So just like when I was on the news on CBS and I was broadcasting out stories, you have that same power with the people in your life. The key is what you choose to talk about and the questions you choose to ask. So can you be the source of positive news that's happening at your office or in your family? Can you be constantly asking questions that helps get people to those places? So, my favorite, one of my favorite chapters in the book was this focused around this concept of leading questions. It's not about leading somebody in the sense of, a trial attorney in court to a specific answer. Leading questions are to lead someone into positive territory. So a question could be, if you have children, when they come home from school, oftentimes we'll say, "So, how was your day today? How was school?" And, "Oh, fine." And you barely get any information out of them, right? Whereas if you can ask a leading question, what was the best thing that happened to you today in school? Or what was the coolest thing you learned in school? That's getting their brain to scan their environment for something positive and meaningful that happened to them that they can share with you. And then when you know about good stuff that's happening at your office, around the dinner table, whatever, be the bearer of, the share of good news as opposed to the bearer of bad news. Constantly repeat that. "Hey, remember how you got an A on that test last week? It's awesome. That was awesome. I saw all the effort that you put into studying for it." Don't just one and done. Let's constantly be talking about the good stuff, because that is ultimately also how we rewrite the narrative. By focusing more on the good stuff as opposed to letting our brain go in the natural direction that it often does, which is to focus on threats in our environment, we can rewrite how our memories and how our brain processes our lives.
It's interesting you bring up that particular example of spinning the positive in a way that can be taken in a much more productive way with people. Because I know, and I have no idea, I can't recall what I was listening to this in, but they were talking about how when a child does well in school and you say, "Wow, you're so smart," and everything like that, and that's not really a positive way to take. This wasn't in your book, was it? It might have been in your book. I read so many things that I don't know which I'm talking about, but they were saying that you really focus on the effort that was made to achieve that, rather than just, "Oh, you're so smart," because that really kind of diminishes the whole effort aspect of it.
Yeah, so I love this. And you mentioned Carol Dweck earlier. This came from Carol Dweck.
Okay.
She's absolutely phenomenal. And so she researches that idea of a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. And I love her studies, because what they show us is that, she looks at it especially with children, but I think that this plays very very parallel in the corporate world as well, if you're a manager and you have a team. She looks at the difference between having a fixed mindset and where our intelligence, our abilities, our skill, like they're all fixed. Our brain thinks that they're fixed, versus a growth mindset where we believe that we can grow and learn, whether we consciously believe it or we just sort of naturally gravitate towards that. And you might just say, I love math. I love studying math. I love English. And you have a love of reading. So that's an example of a growth mindset. The interesting thing is that with school-age children, if your child gets an A in math, on a test, you might say, oh, great job, you got an A. Oh, I love you so much. You are so smart. You're awesome. And while that might seem like you're praising them, that can ultimately create a fixed mindset versus praising them on their efforts. The reason is that when we just praise them on the actual outcome, they got the A, they now find themselves in a privileged position, right? I'm loved, I'm smart, this is great, and I don't want to sacrifice this privileged position. I want to stay where I am, and so I'm not going to take too many risks. And again, they do this unconsciously oftentimes, what she found. So when they have the opportunity to, do extra work on a project and or just maybe take an advanced class, they maybe might hang back because they want to keep those A's and keep that privileged position. Whereas if you say, hey, you got an A on that test, do you see how hard you studied? You put so much effort into getting that A. Great job. Then they see that it's the effort and not the outcome that's prized.
Right.
And so I think it's so wonderful when you think about in the corporate world, if you're going to try to spur progress and promote, motivate your team by focusing on not just the outcome, which is already a prize. Hey, I hit my sales target. That's already good. And you probably get a check, and that's awesome. But instead focusing on the elements that allow the person to achieve that. The phone calls they made, the relationships they built, the sales strategies, the PowerPoints they created, whatever it is, by focusing on those and praising for that, that is really when we promote higher levels of success.
Yeah. Does that go along with participation trophies that everybody gets now? And they're
I know. A lot of people have asked me about that, like what I think, and I'm just like, I don't think you get a trophy for just showing up. Oh my goodness. You get a trophy for really excelling. That's like, come on, let's get back to
putting that effort into achieving that. Yeah. No, I do like that though. I like the way you take somebody, and it's important in a work environment. I mean, if you're going to praise somebody in a work environment, you're not going to praise them and say, hey, you brought in X number of dollars, great job, here's your bonus, and do it in front of everybody, because then they're not looking at what went into that necessarily. So if you talk about what they did to achieve that, I think there's where your really positive spin can be advanced for the workplace.
And we work with executives at all kinds of companies and organizations, and oftentimes we look at what elements are going into the performance review. How are you handling those? Those things are stressful for employees. Oftentimes people, I got a 3.9 out of 4. Why didn't I get a 4? What happened? Or, whatever. And so a lot of times people think, or managers especially think, oh, well, I need to work with my employees to help them see the things they need to improve upon. So I'll say a couple nice things, and then we'll get really, down to brass tacks. The problem though is that a lot of us know the things that we already need to improve upon. Some people are totally blind to it, and then helping them see that, yes, can be valuable. But we discount how valuable it can be to identify all that's working right. And by dissecting situations, meetings, goal attainment, and to understand the elements that really did work, that can actually promote greater levels of success than just looking at the things that didn't work and how to fix them.
Yeah. Now, how much of a role do you think that stress plays in happiness and impacts happiness? I know Amy Cuddy's new book, Presence, she talks a lot about the the high testosterone and to have power in that, you still have to have low cortisol, and so the person who can handle the stress well can take that power position pretty well. Does that fall in the same realms of happiness? I mean, do we see these stress hormones and things like that affecting that?
Absolutely. Constant state of stress, then happiness becomes infinitely more challenging. I actually don't think you can be in a negative stress state and happy at the same time. Now, there are ways to process stress in a way that can actually fuel happiness. And we did a study at UBS and worked with high-level managers there that were tax audit managers. Split them into two groups and trained one in the usual stress management training, which is, hey, here are all the negative effects of stress, and here is basically how you fight or flee from it, how you deal with it. With the other group, we trained them and showed them equally scientifically valid research studies that actually paint a completely different picture. They show about how stress can actually be enhancing to the body. It can improve memory, cognitive functioning, mental agility, your ability to hit your deadlines. And then we talk to them about ways to rethink their relationship with stress and process it differently as it's happening. And then we follow them over time. What we found was 4 months later, during the midst of the busy, stressful, highly stressful tax season, the people who had gone through that second kind of training, the stress is enhancing training, actually reported a 23% drop in stress-related symptoms like headaches, backaches, and fatigue. So what that tells us is if our brain can process stress in a different way, because then we can actually experience less of the negative effects. So I'm not saying, oh, go out and find more stressful situations. That's definitely not what we want to do. But when we find ourselves in those, by transforming our mindset, that actually has a huge influence on our body. And then what we see is when we look at the three greatest predictors of long-term levels of success, that is one of the three, and that absolutely connects with long-term happiness. When we can process stress in a more enhancing way, then that allows us to achieve higher levels of happiness on a regular basis.
Now, in that study, did you guys look at the actual cortisol levels of the executives?
We did not test for cortisol in that study. One of my research colleagues from that study she's now looking at that. And because what we were looking at was self-reported negative consequences of stress.
Okay, yeah, because we deal a lot with kind of the stress disconnect in my medical practice. So we train people through biofeedback to disconnect the physiologic processes of the stress with the psychological processes of the stress, so that they're able to function with clarity and not experience the hyperventilations and the elevated heart rate and the temperature that feeds back and creates that negative response. But you ask them specifically about the experience of the situation. They'll say, yeah, it was stressful, but they don't have the physiologic response to it. And I'm just wondering if, when you're taking the stress in a positive way with these executives, if that's creating the ability to disconnect the physical from the mental.
Yeah, because it helps us, I think, take a beat, right? Because oftentimes the situation unfolds and we're feeling stressed, and we unconsciously and instantly launch into the reaction. This training was to help them say, oh, okay, this is a stressful situation. Whoa, I'm starting to feel stressed. Here's what's happening to my brain and body, and how can I process this in a different way? How can I think about this differently? And how can my body then follow suit? And that mental beat can be so powerful. What I think is really encouraging about Amy Cuddy's work is how quickly she shows us that we can change the neurochemicals and the body chemicals that we experience. In the talks that I give at companies, I ask everyone sort of 15 minutes into the talk, when I'm hopefully not boring them at that point, I ask them to do a power pose, strike a power. I call it an anchor pose because, my journals and broadcasting days. And
Oh, yeah.
the idea is to do what Amy Cuddy suggests, which is feel more powerful through your physical body, and then see what happens to your brain and how you feel. And she found in just 2 minutes you can lower your levels of cortisol and increase your levels of testosterone significantly. And that is just absolutely amazing. So I think we have more power over our bodies than we realize. It's just about being trained on how to do it.
I think I'm going to do that from now on. Every time I encounter someone being negative, I'm going to assume the power pose. Overwhelm them with my power. I think that would work. What do you think?
I think that's great. I love it.
We focus a lot of efforts in my medical practice too on optimizing sleep. I mean, do you see sleep playing a major role in happiness? I mean, I know it has a huge effect on health, but it seems like happiness too. I mean, I know there's nights when I don't get my full 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep. I am not my usual happy, cheerful self.
Yeah. I think that's the way for the vast majority of us. I have a brother-in-law named Bobo, and Dr. Bobo, I love that. He's a pediatrician. And he can last on 5.5 hours, no problem. But we are cut from two different cloths. I don't know how he does it. When I'm not sleeping well, I do not feel good. And if I get a hair less than 7.5 hours, and really 8 is better, then yeah, it just doesn't work. What's fascinating, there was a study done where people were given lists of words. One list was positive and one list was negative, and then split into 2 groups. And they were asked to memorize those words. They had time to kind of read through them and think about them and memorize them. And then one group was allowed to sleep, I believe, if I remember correctly, for about 5 hours. The other group was allowed to sleep for 8 hours. And then they were tested on the words in the morning. And the group that slept for only 5 hours, they actually remembered significantly more negative words than they remembered positive words compared to the group that got more sleep. And I mean, that's amazing. What that shows us is that our brains, when we have less resources and we're not feeling as great, our brain holds on to that negative information, basically the threats in our environment, and has less resources to look at the positive things going on in our lives. So without a doubt, sleep is, for me, it's number one, and it helps me just see a bigger picture of reality, which hopefully also includes all the great things that are going on in life.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely the key for us to get people optimized. I mean, the first step is optimizing sleep. If we can't get sleep fixed in people, we have a very difficult time in getting them to optimal performance. Yes. No question about it. Now, I want to bring this up too, is there a happy pill? I mean, we have a lot of medications out there that are the happy pills, and I guess we take them because we are not happy and we don't want to feel it anymore. But generally, I mean, you're talking about pills that are going to change brain function in a certain way. Is there a benefit to taking antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication?
I think that there's a portion of the population that those are a saving grace, and they're absolutely necessary. I do think, though, that in general we're over-medicated, unfortunately, because people think that this is the path I should take. There was a study done with a popular antidepressant and testing it against exercise, looking for what the relapse rate would be after a period of time back into depression. And what they found, researchers found, was when they split people into 3 groups, those who took the antidepressants, those who exercised, and those who did both, that the group that exercised had a 39% lower relapse rate into another depressive episode than the folks who exercised. And what I think that shows us is that, or what I've taken away from this study, it's not a repudiation of antidepressants. Like I said, I think for some people it's absolutely the right step. and that is to work on with your doctor and figure out the right plan. But what it reminds us is that when we can create a situation in which we see that our behavior matters, in other words, I do something, I feel better, I do it again, I feel better and better, then that allows us to then have that tool to go back to. So if the people were in the study were asked to exercise, a handful of times a week for 30 minutes at a time, and then they saw, whoa, this is making me feel better. And then if I'm feeling not great, one day I can go back and exercise, and it doesn't spiral back down into depression.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I think and this is whether someone's experiencing depression or just a low mood and could use a pick-me-up, I absolutely believe that the path to joy is lined with gratitude. The more that we can actively search for things we're grateful for in life, by looking for the good stuff going on in our relationships, the wonderful meal we had, the beautiful sunset we saw, the more we're refocusing our attention on the positive and getting our brain to more naturally see those elements of our life. And that, I think, ultimately is what creates a more optimistic, positive default level of happiness.
We hear a lot about that, though. I mean, this positive affirmations, these gratitude things. I mean, it's ubiquitous. I mean, everybody talks about how great it is. Does it make a substantial difference, though? I mean, if we journal gratitudes each morning, I mean, just briefly, I mean, 5 minutes of journaling gratitudes, or in the evening before we go to bed, positive affirmations, how big of an impact does that truly have?
Yeah, it's huge. So the positive psychology, every single major religious tradition, spiritual belief system, Norman Vincent Peale, everyone who has been thinking about how to live your life better and positive thinking has talked about gratitude. The difference about positive psychology is that we study how effective it is, what are the changes that actually occur, and what's the smallest necessary dose that you can use in your life, how to do it, and to understand for the average person what's the best way to do it to get the biggest effect. There was a study done where patients who were experiencing chronic pain were asked to journal about the most meaningful moment over the past 24 hours. And they were asked to do this for a period of 6 months. At the end of that 6-month period, those people who had kept up the daily habit, doctors were able to drop their pain medication in half.
Mm-hmm.
So what that reminds us is that, these might sound like tips or tricks. Oh, just write your little gratitudes in your cute little journal. No, this is the building blocks of transforming how our brain processes the world. So I absolutely believe in it. And if someone wants sort of their starter drug here, journaling just for 2 minutes about the most meaningful moment over the past 24 hours can be incredibly effective. That's on a small journal that's literally half the page. So don't go crazy and write 10 minutes and then overwhelm yourself for the next day that you have to match that. And then the other thing is just write down 3 new and unique things you're grateful for each day. You can do it for a period of 21 days. The key is to be new and unique so that you're not just every day saying, my kids, my health, and the sunset. You really want to push that gratitude muscle and expand it. And be specific. I'm grateful for my health because it allows me to go running in the afternoons. And I absolutely love that and the fresh air that I get to breathe during that time.
Now, I'm going to venture into the world of transhumanism kind of on you here. We love the fact that we have this ability to manipulate brain neuroplasticity and everything. So we do some neurofeedback work, and we can do some brainwave pattern reprogramming with the neurofeedback. Is there any evidence right now on brain reprogramming that can be done to improve happiness?
Well, what we find now is that the people who were able to, do their gratitudes for a period of 6 months, as I mentioned earlier, they went from testing as low-level pessimists to low to moderate-level optimists. These were gentlemen who were 60, 70 years old and been practicing pessimism for their entire lives. And so I think at any point in our lives we can see it. But even outside of the studies, anecdotally, I mean, people write to us to our website. They share their story there, and these are folks of all ages. But they're like, oh, I started doing one of these positive habits, and it has transformed my life. And they tell us specifically how. And one story that I absolutely love. This was pretty recent. We received this. Someone we had, we delivered a talk, and they decided to adopt one of the habits to say gratitudes. But this was a dad, and he said, so I didn't want to do it at the office. I wanted to take this home to my kids. And so I went to the first night home, and I sat around the dinner table, and my teenage daughter was basically rolling her eyes at me. Dad, you want us to do our gratitudes together? It's so lame. And then the other kid, the 10-year-old, sort of obliged, but wasn't really into it either. And so he said that it was a little rough going in the beginning, but eventually they got into a little bit of a habit. A couple weeks later, he gets a phone call from another parent at the school. His daughter had been at a sleepover at this guy's house with a whole bunch of other girls, and he said, I'm really sorry, I have to tell you what your daughter did the other day. He said, oh no, what's going on? Turns out it wasn't a bad thing. The girl had decided that people were being mean at school, and so she got all of her girlfriends together at the sleepover to sit around in a circle on the basement floor and to go around and say one nice thing about each person in the room. And I think that, and so, the father asked, where did you get that? Why did you decide to do it? He said, well, we've been saying our gratitudes around the dinner table, so I wanted to say things that we are grateful for about, about my friends. I thought it would be nice and lift everyone's spirits. And I mean, that is amazing. I mean, that small change in parenting, in how we approach our work and the way we approach our lives, I mean, that can have a huge ripple effect and permanently influence that daughter for the rest of her life.
Well, and the way we behave around the children, I mean, that has a huge influence on what they experience and what they go out and promote too. I mean, we've found that, and we try to stay as positive as we can around. Well, we're positive all the time, so but we try to do it more so around the kids and be more overt about it. But yeah, I mean, you can see a difference in them when they're around that positive mindset rather than around some of their friends who are can be kind of negative. So it's really cool stuff. Well, I don't want to keep you up late tonight. I know we've taken you away from your happiness family there in Texas, and I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of come on and answer some questions for us and just have a nice little interaction. So I hope everybody understands to go out and buy Michelle's book, because it's really an awesome read. And I noticed you're at a 4.8 out of 5 rating on Amazon, which is pretty awesome on the reviews. So how are you doing on the New York Times bestseller? Are you up there yet?
We were so blessed. We did hit the bestseller list, which was very exciting. But I'm so thankful to everyone who's read the book, and also those of you who have written in and shared your stories. I mean, that's been the best part of it, right? It's connecting with people like you and with other people who've written to us, and how they're personalizing the message, taking it home to their children, and it's just been fantastic. And by the way, I also encourage everyone to visit our website, broadcastinghappiness.com. The success scale, that 30-question assessment that I mentioned and I talk about in the book, you can take it. So I encourage you to come take it for free. And it takes like 3 to 5 minutes, and it spits out an interpretive report and your scores. So I hope it's helpful. It's something we've scientifically validated it using many of the companies that we work with, and so I hope you find it useful.
Well, if you can send me a link to that, I'll mail it out to everybody who registered for the website
Great. Awesome.
Webinar as well. So. Again, thank you very much, Michelle, and thanks for everybody that attended, and stay tuned and broadcast your happiness.
Take care.